Thank you for being here for part 5 of Pivoting on Research, Human Subjects Research Recruiting Children and At-Risk Populations. Our guest today is T. Howard Stone. He's the director of the Office for Human Subjects Protection at Florida State University. He previously served as an IRB Vice-Chair and member of IRBs at the University of Texas Health Science Center, University of Louisville, and University of Texas Medical Branch. Howard has served as principal investigator and project director for numerous NIH, CDC, and foundation grants and cooperative agreements. And without further ado, Howard, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Evangeline. And it's good to feel royal. So I nice segue into the introduction. So anyway, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for attending this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to talk these things over. This webinar, as you can see from the title slide, is focused upon children and other persons who are considered vulnerable as human research participants, and I'm going to more commonly refer to as human subjects, so I'll interchange those terms. I've geared this webinar to a general audience. So some of you may already be familiar with some of the concepts that I'm going to go over and some of the subject matter that we'll be covering. So anyway, time permitting, we can later go over some of your questions that you have that may deal with more advanced concepts or issues, because there are many. And also you may always contact me offline to discuss these concepts, these issues, and any other concerns or questions you may have about involving populations in your studies, whether they're vulnerable, like the ones we're going to cover today, or other subjects as well. My contact information for that purpose is going to be provided on the last slide. So during the question and answer session, we'll linger over that slide so that you have a copy of my contact information. So first of all, I want to acknowledge all of those whose artwork or graphics and some of the content derived from other sources, particularly the regulatory and legal sources. I certainly acknowledge those sources and their contribution to this particular session. Again, if you want additional resources, I certainly have a large bibliography of materials that pertain to both human subjects generally and vulnerable populations particularly. So feel free to ask me for that offline as well. What we're going to do today is the purpose is the following 1 through 4. So who is vulnerable and why, how they're vulnerable and how they're protected, what to include in your study protocols to address the requirements that pertain to involving vulnerable human subjects in your studies, and then of course leaving the last portion of the session for questions and answers. So importantly, I'm going to use some case studies to provide you with some context, including illustrating populations that are considered big V vulnerable. For human research activities in this country and for which research a number of laws may apply, researchers and institutions like FSU have to take special steps to protect these individuals from research risks. So we'll go over in more detail what some of those special steps are. Okay, so listed here, speaking of the case studies that provide context, listed here are some 4 case studies that I've compiled from prior research with which I'm familiar, and these could include studies both here at FSU and the other institutions that Evangeline told you about, where I served as both a faculty member and as an IRB member. These case studies will provide us with some useful context to talk about some of the more abstract principles and concepts related to protecting human subjects generally, and of course, protecting subjects who are deemed big V vulnerable. All right, so who and why are persons vulnerable? And the reason why I've been using big V and little v is clearly in our own life experiences, it might be intuitive to us about persons who we think, well, that's a vulnerable person, and with regard to research, they're definitely going to be vulnerable, and I have to think about that more carefully. But there are esteemed groups of bioethicists, lawyers, researchers who've thought about this for a very long time, and they've come up with a list of people who are deemed vulnerable with a big V. And that list and those concepts about protecting these people, they came out of what was called the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report is considered the ethical foundation for today's current legal protections for vulnerable subjects. So in other words, while there were laws put into place for how these persons ought to be protected once they've been identified as vulnerable, there is an important grounding for those protections. And it's the ethical foundation that was arrived at and, of course, publicized in this Belmont Report. So I provided you with the URL at which the Belmont Report is located. And as you can see here, the presumption is that persons are considered to have the capacity for self-determination. So we begin with that presumption. People can control for themselves what goes on in their lives, particularly with regard to taking part as human subjects in our studies. And therefore, we must consider it a privilege to have persons willingly take part in our research activities and include taking all the steps necessary to preserve that privilege that we have. But note, however, that the last phrase there that I've bolded, persons with diminished capacity, they're entitled to certain protection. And the laws deem certain persons to have this diminished autonomy and therefore assigns researchers, you all, IRB members, people like myself, others at FSU, with the responsibility for taking steps to ensure that persons with diminished autonomy are protected. So this is an excerpt from the federal law. So on the prior slide, I took an excerpt from the ethics monograph that served as a foundation for the laws that we're familiar with today. This, on this slide, is an excerpt from the very federal law that describes what persons are vulnerable as human subjects. So you can see here, this provision in the law highlights those very groups: children, prisoners, persons who are decisionally impaired, and persons who, for example, may be impoverished or who lack sufficient educational attainment. Note that the blue highlighted text, such as, means that the following list are some examples, but they are the principal examples. But it suggests to us that there may be other persons who may also be vulnerable to coercion and undue influence. And just think for yourselves, well, who are those others that might be deemed vulnerable? And on this campus, we can think of a number, right? We can think of, for example, employees who report to their employers or their supervisors. Certainly students who are compelled to follow the directions and instructions of faculty, of advisors, the graduate office, and so forth. Patients who obviously are subject to the advice, counsel, and the directions of their healthcare providers, and military service members who obviously are indoctrinated to follow the orders of their superiors. So the law spells out these are foremost vulnerable individuals, but there may be others. And so in the back of our minds, we may want to think about, well, who else are we going to include in our studies? And even though they're not articulated specifically as vulnerable subjects, could other people be vulnerable as human subjects in our research activities? So it always bears mention that this provision of the law does not preclude you and the IRB from considering other persons who may be human subjects as being vulnerable in some way. So here again is that list of case studies for this session, and I've underlined the key term in these case studies to emphasize their vulnerability. Keep in mind that some of these and other studies may involve subjects that are deemed big V vulnerable, but that small v vulnerability may be relative within these groups. For example, younger children compared to older, impoverished individuals compared to those who are better off, offenders versus those who aren't, and for example, food nutrition beneficiaries as opposed to those who have food security. So even within groups, there may be relative vulnerability. And keep in mind also that many studies will include people who are vulnerable and those that are not. So for example, in the summer camp example, instructional supports and alcohol cessation interventions, these may be examined, these research topics may be explored without regard to subject vulnerable status, or it may be a special focus of the study. So keep that in mind that things are dynamic. There can be differences within vulnerable groups, and then studies may involve both vulnerable persons as well as non-vulnerable persons. So here we have a list of some, but clearly not all, for those of you who have submitted study protocols for review at this IRB or at other IRBs. But these are some of the steps by which study subjects are to be protected from research risks. I've converted the regulatory text into some layperson words so that your eyes don't glass over on me. But these are the steps by which study subjects are to be protected. And we can look over these quickly, all of which you should already be familiar with and have or currently implement in your past and current studies. So clearly, we want to have a study team that knows what they're doing, not only in terms of the science, but in terms of the subject population and in terms of what's required for human subject protection. So this is why you're familiar with that city human subject protection training requirement that FSU has for its researchers. We want you to know who you're dealing with. We also, in terms of the IRB and sponsors, of course, they want to know that you too know your science, that you're not duplicating studies for which findings have been well established, and that you're going to expand the scientific knowledge pertaining to particular topics. So they want you knowledgeable and trained in these particular methods and scientific knowledge. Second, you certainly want an organized and comprehensive protocol laid out following the templates that FSU provides depending on the type of study, so biomedical, social behavioral, and so forth. Informed consent is important, as is minimizing risks, balancing those risks against benefits, a very key concept we'll go over later. Equitable selection of subjects, and so we want to make sure that we don't focus on certain vulnerable populations if non-vulnerable subjects will be just as productive for informing the knowledge that we want to acquire. And then, of course, some type of regulatory or IRB review and ongoing oversight. So those are, the last bullet is calibrated to the study, and we'll talk about that later. So how are vulnerable subjects protected? So the last slide indicated generally what protections are in place. And again, that wasn't an exhaustive list. But in terms of vulnerable subjects, clearly we want to see, reflecting the prior slide, that you have specialized knowledge and training. So in other words, if you're going to work with children, you should have worked with children before or have knowledge about working with children, the research topics for which children are necessary as study subjects. And in terms of training, there are within the city training different modules on involving, for example, children or prisoners or mentally incapacitated individuals. So when you work with vulnerable subjects, you should have knowledge that's particular to that population. Clearly, your protocols, they'll be expected to address vulnerable subjects. I'll go over those later in terms of who they are, where they're coming from, what you're going to do to protect them. For consent, for a vulnerable population like children, you have to have the child's assent, or essentially the child's agreement to take part, again, calibrated to the age and development of the child. You certainly will require parental permission. And for some children, for example, those who are wards of states, foster children, for example, you may be required to have an advocate who stands in place of a parent in making sure that you'll have that permission to involve that child in research. For certain research involving vulnerable subjects, sometimes the ability to conduct research that's more than minimal risk is not permitted. Or if it is permitted, it's subject to heightened scrutiny. For example, only certain studies that involve more than minimal risk may involve children. For example, those that have direct benefit, or for which there's no substitute for gaining knowledge, but to involve children in those studies. And for prisoners, for example, is greater than minimal risk, then approval has to take place after IRB has rendered its decision. So when IRB says, yes, you may proceed with research involving prisoners as more than minimal risk, that protocol has to go to federal agencies for their approval. So risk is a key criteria for determining the level of scrutiny, whether the research is going to be permitted, and if there are any other review layers that are going to be imposed. So important to keep in mind. The next to last bullet, what I've mentioned before, use non-vulnerable before vulnerable subjects. So it's clearly, if it's not necessary to involve persons who are mentally incapacitated, then don't. If you can get by using young adults as opposed to older age children, go for the younger adults. If prisoners are not necessarily required, but you can get similar information from those who've already been released, then use non-prisoners who are previously offenders. So, and then finally, for vulnerable subjects, there is focused regulatory review and oversight that I just talked about. Now I want to segue to what an IRB might expect to see in protocols, similar to what I've just gone over, in which the study sample involves, in whole or in part, again, studies could involve some vulnerable and some not, who may be vulnerable as human subjects. There are generally, again, since there are a number of different sections of any protocol, a statement of the study's objectives. In other words, what do you plan to do? What's your purpose? What are your specific aims? A description of the study sample, who's going to be involved? Where are you going to draw your prospective study subject? A description of the research risks of harms and discomforts, the anticipated benefits that may be expected to accrue to either the study subjects or the knowledge that you hope to gain, and a description of how members of the sample will be recruited and consented, including providing consent and recruitment material. So this is what protocols should include at a minimum. So let's begin with including study objectives. So, for example, objectives for this particular example. Objective 1 might be, we will implement instructional supports for reading modules in schools that serve economically disadvantaged school districts and schools. Second objective might be, we will compare elementary school students and families that do and do not receive these supports. So you have a control and an intervention group. Findings will be shared clearly with participating school districts. Maybe not. I've seen some studies that do not share their findings with participating populations or institutions, but often they do. And the findings will be disseminated through professional educational organizations and in the literature to be shared with persons who may have shared interests in your study and its outcome. You may say that findings may indicate that, 1, families and teachers may find the supports easy to adopt. Second, that supports lead to improved reading achievement among elementary school students in economically disadvantaged communities. So that's what you might want to say and describe in your study objectives. Here we talk about including information about the sample that you can draw upon, in particular with regard to the case study involving alcohol cessation interventions with prisoners. For this example, we want to say that first, the study sample will include up to 100 persons incarcerated in Florida state prisons with at least 9 months remaining on their sentence of imprisonment. You probably want to do this because you need enough time to both recruit, consent, start your intervention, and complete it before these individuals are released back into the general community. So that might be one thing in terms of describing the population. You may want to say, hey, what are some of the special characteristics we want? So you might state that inclusion criteria will include offenders who first are 18 years of age or older. That way you don't have to worry so much about the assent part. Who, second, have a history of alcohol-related offenses, because clearly what's the point of involving them in an alcohol cessation program? You want to be sure that you have people who clearly have a history of it. And third, who consent to take part in your study. Conversely, in terms of exclusion criteria, you may want to say you don't want participants that include offenders who, 1, lack decision-making capacity, because otherwise you will have to get some type of, say, for example, legally authorized representative, if it's even going to be possible. Second, you want to exclude people who are incarcerated for a violent crime, because those are going to be more difficult to recruit to a study and to participate in a program, and obviously going to take a long time to get released to the general population or to the general community, for which an objective alcohol cessation intervention may include, preventing reoffense or preventing, continued alcohol use, and may not want offenders who are housed in high security units, because again, These are individuals who probably are incarcerated for a violent crime or some disciplinary infraction while they're in prison. They're also going to be very difficult to access for an intervention purpose. So there are things like this, facets of your sample that you want to tease out so that both you know that the odds are better that you're going to be able to accrue this type of sample to your study and improve the odds of successful completion or achievement of your study objectives, and also who are going to be easy in terms of consent. So let's talk about research risks and how you might include information and descriptions of research risks in your study protocol. So note that the IRB is going to consider risks and benefits that result from the research, and they generally will not consider the risks and benefits of therapies that study subjects would receive if not taking part. So let's go back to that prior example that I talked about, alcohol cessation intervention in prison. It may be that maybe those programs are already being provided, but your research just one looks at outcome. So the provisioning of that intervention and the related risks are not of concern to the IRB. It's what you're going to do in addition to that program. A risk fall generally into two categories, minimal and greater than minimal risk. And minimal risk means the probability and magnitude of harm and discomfort are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during routine physical or psychological exams. So like I said earlier, risk may determine whether research is permissible for certain subpopulations, might result in other requirements like that additional review that I mentioned, and clearly will determine the scrutiny that the IRB is going to put on a study. So more scrutiny, the greater the risk, less scrutiny, the minimum risk. We want to talk about benefits. So clearly the IRB is going to weigh the research risks to the benefits, because the more there are benefits, the more able or more acceptable certain research risks are. For example, if there's direct benefit to a subject, they're going to come out better able to deal with their condition. The higher the risk, the IRB or the regulation will permit. So that's very important to keep in mind that the IRB is going to weigh risk to benefit. And keep in mind, even though we want to know if you're going to pay people, participation payments or nominal gifts are not going to be considered, are never considered a benefit. The direct benefits that may accrue to SNAP beneficiaries may include acquiring skills for identifying healthy food products available for purchase using their EBT cards. Another benefit may be to show how the results of the study will be used to demonstrate to state food assistance programs the added value of providing nutritional counseling to those who receive these types of SNAP benefits. I save consent and recruitment for last because clearly it merits your careful attention. So you want to make sure that there's key information in the study. For example, consent is being sought for research, the purpose and duration of the study, the risks I just talked about, those benefits that I went over, and if there are any appropriate alternative procedures to the course of treatment. And here, when we talk about a reasonable person, it's a fictitious person, but that's the standard, who has ordinary degree of reason, skill, foresight, and intelligence, who, if they were placed in the prospective subject's position, would want certain information from you to make a decision about taking part. And for vulnerable subjects, there are special consent and recruitment requirements. For example, I went over, for children, you have to get assent, and the assent is going to be calibrated to their age. Consent will also involve the parental permission, and both parents are going to be required if the study is greater than minimum. So again, the requirements for consent and recruitment are going to be calibrated to the vulnerability of the person and the risk of the study. For prisoners, for example, information must be provided in language that is understandable to prisoners. And they also have to be informed in advance that taking part is going to have no effect upon their parole or probation. So you can see here, special consent requirements. Consent language should generally never exceed the 8th grade reading level. So whatever population you use, adults, postdocs, people with professional degrees, or elementary school students, consent language should not ever exceed the 8th grade reading level and should be less depending on the prospective subject's educational attainment or disadvantage. And again, you can see from our website that we have different templates for the consent forms. They're geared towards whether the person is an adult or child, whether it's biomedical or social behavioral educational research. There are certain short forms for versions who may have limited English proficiency. So all these templates are available to you on our website and through RAMP IRB. And finally, please be aware that because of the recent COVID pandemic, right, special protections have to be put into place for prospective subjects that you're going to involve and who you may have some in-person interaction or intervention. So they need to be informed that you're taking steps to protect them from COVID-related exposure. The university has also indicated that only certain studies involving interventions and interactions may proceed. So on our website, we've laid out the exceptions to research involving individuals in this pandemic period in which you can conduct these activities. So those certain requirements include like providing them an information sheet, talking about the steps you're going to take, like social distancing, use of masks, disinfecting, and so forth. And for other studies where, hey, I need to do online activities rather than in person, you want to talk about the risk related to converting in-person activities to an online format. So at the highlighted or linkable pages there, you can find additional information for those templates, and in particular, information and templates that are COVID. And we can enter Q&A at this time.
Awesome. So we know that COVID is a complex issue right now. And even though the science is out there about what it is, I know I've seen, and probably a lot of us can testify to the fact that there are a lot of different interpretations and beliefs about how dangerous it might be. I mean, there's a good chance somebody in our research study who's a part of a vulnerable population may not believe that wearing masks is something to do or social distancing is something that matters. How can we help keep vulnerable populations who may not realize their own vulnerability safe in our studies?
It's a very good question. So what the university has done is it creates a responsibility for the study teams to determine who's vulnerable. So for example, clearly you're absolutely right that there's competing information, there's ambiguous information and conflicting information out there. But we expect our FSU researchers who are scientists to both acknowledge and to adopt the scientific knowledge about mitigating COVID-related risk to study subjects. So what we've done is, as part of the university's policy on research involving human subjects in this pandemic, we expect them to, one, screen people who may be vulnerable. So it's almost immaterial that someone presents to you saying, well, I don't believe the science, I'm invulnerable, I'm a super person, I'm not going to worry about the risk, please enroll me. Well, we won't accept that posture because as scientists, we're expected to know better than the general population. And we're expected to know what the scientific experts have said are the best ways to protect people. So clearly, first and foremost is we want to screen individuals who we know the science says are vulnerable. So people who have diabetes, people who have serious heart conditions, people who have recent. Also, we know as scientists that social distancing works. So as part of our policy at FSU, we make sure that in our research interventions, we have social distancing. And some interventions, social distancing is not as possible. So we're going to social distance from many of our studies, but there's some activities, like for example, I'm going to apply a blood pressure cuff, I'm going to apply a body sensor, I'm going to draw blood or other tissue sample. Well, that clearly you're going to come within that 2 meter or 6 foot social distancing limit. But you tell people that, and research study team members have to acknowledge that some things they're going to do are not going to fall within social distancing, but will certainly minimize the time, the duration, and the number of people who are within that 2 meter or 6 foot space. And then use of masks, disinfecting materials that are shared among study staff and with study subjects, like pens, paper, logs, clipboards, things like that. Those have to be cleaned and disinfected. And study subjects, like you said, have to be encouraged. Here's some hand sanitizer. please step over here to wash your hands. So regardless of what they think about the science, about their vulnerable status, we as researchers still have to implement the responsible things to make sure they're still protected. It's a very good question.
Thank you for this talk. This is great. So we are involved in a study currently that definitely works with these vulnerable populations. Specifically, we're working with preschool children with autism spectrum disorder, right? And so for some of our procedures, particularly when we're giving educational assessments, we will need to have access or physical access to children. Now, when we're thinking about the precautions that we're going to take and submit to IRB for their consideration, we were talking about screening not only like our research staff in terms of, temperature screening, and so forth, but then also thinking about how do we screen the students, and if we're allowed, many schools will have some procedures in place, right? Like when they come to school, teachers will be taking temperature and screening kids. So are we allowed or are we permitted to rely on the school screening procedure, or are we going to be expected as a research team to also replicate that on the days that we're going in to test kids?
Great question, Veronica. And this is kind of a two-parter. Clearly, you want to take the school's own screening procedures into account as you do with any steps that the school is taking to either identify children for your study and give their permission to enter those classrooms and take them out of classrooms to do these assessments and so forth. The important thing, though, that FSU is requiring is that the study teams conduct their own independent screening, clearly of your own study staff, but of prospective study subjects. And what we did was on our COVID web page, in the template that we provide to the research community, we talk about screening, and we talk about the types of questions you should ask. But importantly, as you know, the changing, very fluid environment for screening, what we've done is we've provided links to both, I think it's the Cleveland Clinic, and to Apple, who in conjunction with CDC developed these two online, very easy screening tools that probably took I walked through both of them, and took about 30 seconds to walk through. And you don't necessarily have to go to that online site to pull down, to process an online screening form, but these two are wonderful resources to develop, say, a paper screening form or screening form, a list of questions that you can put on your iPad or your tablet or whatever, and ask these questions. And from the FSU perspective, that's entirely adequate. So if you think that the school screening form covers the types of screening questions available at these two links, great. And so you can accept the school's screening steps. Or if you don't think they're up to your snuff, at least in accordance with FSU policy, you can pose additional questions of the parents of these prospective preschool subjects to ask, and that will be fine too. The IRB is not going to be prescriptive about the particular questions you do, because they want to know, as US scientists know where to go to the experts for those screening questions. So adapt those screening protocols in your own study, and the school's screening methods work, you're in good shape. Two questions often come up is, when investigators design a study and describe a sample, they say, okay, for example, I'm going to go into the community, or I'm going to go into certain institutions like schools or workplaces. And to the IRB, they'll want a little bit more, because the IRB is not only concerned with the sample, but they're concerned also, as researchers are, with making sure that you are able to accrue a sufficiently sized sample such that you're able to accomplish your study objectives on time and of the type of sample you need. So oftentimes, the IRB will advise researchers, will get buy-in or support from the site at which the sample will be drawn. So I know that people like Veronica, they're clearly working with the local institutions or the schools or the programs to make them aware of the study, to share with them how the results may benefit them as well, or the particular study subject. but also get a letter of support so that the IRB understands you've already worked with the institutions at which the sample will be drawn, and they're well aware of what you want to do, and they support it. So clearly, indications of support for recruiting a sample from certain institutions like prisons, schools, and workplace, and so forth, go a long way towards answering the IRB's questions that the study team is going to be able to recruit the sample they want. Because to the IRB, feasibility of the study is an important indicator. And your study sponsors like National Institutes of Health, CDC, AHRQ, your research foundations, they're always going to be interested in the feasibility of the study. And they too will want evidence that you're working with the sites from which the sample will be drawn. So they want to see that because they don't want to invest in a study where the homework wasn't done. So that's some important advice that the IRB can give to researchers about recruitment. The other is like the participation payments. The IRB does not set a per se limit on what you can give or what you can pay to study participants. So for children, for example, or prisoners, a little bit of money means a lot, particularly within a prison environment where a little bit of money can purchase, commissary items, or for school-age children, a little bit of money can mean a lot in terms of what they can do with that. So, but keep in mind that the IRB doesn't have a set limit or threshold over which a participation payment or gift is going to exceed. To the IRB, what they're really concerned about is somehow, will this affect in an adverse way their decision to participate? In other words, would they not participate or find the risk too great, but for the amount of money or the gift that you're going to provide to study subjects? So we ask researchers oftentimes, do the footwork. What are other investigators in similar circumstances, and in particular with similar subject populations, doing, paying, or providing in terms of a gift? So keep that in mind as well, that there's no need to ask the IRB, is $100 or is $5 too much? It's really the IRB is going to look at the prospective subject population and the risk of the study to see if somehow the attractiveness of an incentive payment or a gift will somehow adversely affect their ability to consider the risks of the study before making a decision.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Evangeline, and the Office of ORD for providing this opportunity to meet with our research committee. And again, you can contact me offline. You can contact Evangeline and our ORD contacts to get questions to me. We'll be more than happy to field them.